Welcome back. The protests, the police brutality, and of course, the political fallout after George Floyd's murder is the world's focus now. This week, several media organizations, including the CBC, were criticized for some of their coverage. Former CBC commentator Stockwell Day was criticized for denying the existence of systemic racism in Canada during an appearance on Power and Politics. He compared the bullying he endured as a child with the discrimination faced by visible minorities across this country. He later apologized on Twitter for his comments and decided to leave the program. And Rex Murphy wrote a column for the National Post declaring that, in his view, Canada is not a racist country. Murphy used to be a host at CBC Radio and a commentator on The National. The New York Times published an op-ed from a Republican senator demanding the use of military force against demonstrators. Reporters at the Times responded on Twitter, one writing, "Running this puts Black New York Times staff in danger." The paper now says the Tom Cotton editorial, quote, "did not meet our editorial standards." Black journalists once again find themselves in a familiar and frustrating position.
And it's hard because eventually you will see yourself, you'll see your brother, and you'll see your friends. And you'll feel the pressure and weight to be objective and fair and balanced, but it's almost impossible to completely separate yourself from the story.
The Washington Post put out this video, and the man you see there is Eugene Scott. He's a political reporter at the paper, and he speaks candidly about what it means to be a Black journalist who covers racial inequality. He also talks about how the lack of diversity in newsrooms makes it even tougher to do his job. In the United States, about 22% of newsroom staff include people of color. In Canada, we simply don't know. The most recent statistics we could dig up are almost 15 years old, and back then only 3.4% of newsroom staff included people of color. This year, the Canadian Association of Black Journalists said media companies need to start reporting newsroom demographics regularly. Today, we're not going to ask, is there a problem in Canadian newsrooms? Because there clearly is, and things may be much better than they used to be, but much more clearly needs to change. So to dig into that discussion, Angeline Francis, she's a digital producer at the Toronto Star, is with us from Toronto. And so is Desmond Cole, an award-winning journalist and the author of The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. Thank you both for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Neil.
Angela, let me start with you. Objectivity in journalism and lived experience. You don't believe they have to be at odds?
No, I think that we are kind of programmed to chase after objectivity, and I've always found it to be a little bit of a myth because we are journalists, but we're also human, and every single person has some sort of bias. You have a different kind of experience for your entire life. You grew up somewhere different, a different part of the country, different race, different gender. All these things kind of give you a different perspective, and then it feeds the way that you work and the kinds of stories that you seek out, the kinds of sources that you seek out. But I think that what journalists always need to strive to be is fair, and that is what sets us a bit apart in our profession.
And Desmond, what are your feelings on that idea of objectivity versus lived experience, not versus, the two of them together?
In Canada, the mainstream culture is a white culture. The majority population in Canada is white. And so the Canadian white mainstream media is threatened by the idea that somebody else might get the microphone for a little while and start saying things or analyzing things in a way that they find threatening or challenging to their dominance. So yeah, it's kind of silly to say that somebody's lived experience might get in the way of that, because we're always talking about Black people, we're talking about women, we're talking about queer and trans people. And so the standard for this is supposed to be that the white man is who you see on the news most often, and that he's objective. But if we try to bring in other voices, well, we're not sure, maybe they'll bring something else to the table. I just think we need to be honest. We live in a white-dominated country, and there's a fear that other journalists bringing their opinions to the table will threaten that status quo.
And do you think there's a double standard? I'll start with you, Angeline. When we talk about opinion columns, I mentioned Rex Murphy's column, the New York Times. Do you think there's a double standard when it comes to journalists of color or commentators of color versus white columnists?
Yeah, I think when it comes to columnists of color versus white columnists, I find that the question of being biased or the question of the integrity of your reporting or if you're being fair tends to come to journalists and writers and columnists of color more often than it does to white columnists. Rex Murphy's headline was blatantly a lie last week, and we've had slavery here for 200 years in Canada as well. Even if it didn't look the same way it did in the States, it was still about servitude, and it was still done to Black people. And I feel like the question of bias comes to Black people disproportionately than it does to white journalists, I find. And I think we really need to question why exactly that is. It kind of goes to what Desmond was saying, where we kind of perceive whiteness as the baseline, as neutral, as inherently objective, when, if you think about it, when white people are also writing about white people, is there not some bias that we should be questioning there?
We covered several examples this week, concrete examples of racism in this country, current and in the recent past as well. When we talk about opinion pages, often what folks will say is, it's freedom of speech, and we have to have diverse opinions, different opinions, even if they're controversial. What's your sense, Desmond, of when media outlets run things like that and give that argument in tandem with running those kinds of pieces?
Well, I think that they're doing two things at the same time. I think they're satisfying their majority white audience that this is just an opinion instead of the dominant opinion. And they're provoking and antagonizing the rest of the population and either trying to troll us and get us angry, or to provoke another kind of response out of us, or just to remind us of what our place is. And I mean, it feels strange to me that certain things in Canadian media landscape still need to be debated. People, we talk about Rex Murphy and others, those opinions aren't interesting or new or important. So just placing them in people's faces and kind of being like, well, this is one side of the debate. My humanity is not actually up for debate. The history of Black people in this country is actual documented fact. It's not up for debate. And it's actually harmful to Black and other people of color to keep presenting our real experiences and the subjugation of white supremacy as though, well, there's another side to it. It's actually no different from another very famous quote that we've all seen, which was Donald Trump saying that there were good people in Charlottesville and that you have to look at both sides. That's exactly what the Canadian media is doing when it denies racism and it presents that as just one of many opinions.
When you talk about continuing to have these conversations, I've been at this media organization here at CBC News for about 18 years. Things have certainly improved somewhat, but we still have to keep having this conversation here and in other newsrooms. So what do you think needs to happen in newsrooms across this country, not just to have more diversity of thoughts and experience, but also to ensure those journalists stay?
I think it's become a challenging landscape before I even got into the industry, and as I'm in it currently. I've been working in newsrooms for about 5 years now. And I think one thing that we should really keep an eye on presently is that coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, every industry is going to be experiencing a recession, and there are going to be layoffs, and there already have been layoffs across so many different media organizations in the States. And when it comes to Canada, I think for one thing, we can't afford to lose the few journalists of color that we have in our newsrooms. And I think when it does come time to rehire, that we have to be more critical about who it is we hire. We have to keep data and stats on who it is who populate our newsrooms, whether they're small, whether they're digital, whether they're newspapers. In Canada, we're just so reluctant to even keep a check to make sure that we're keeping up with the standards. So we basically have no standards.
Desmond?
Yeah, I also don't really see the amount of change that you're suggesting may have happened, Neil. I still see a TV and print industry in Canada's media that is overwhelmingly white and hasn't actually changed in what we would expect in the last 20 years. But beyond talking about the personnel and who gets to be on TV or who gets to be in the editing room, those things are extremely important. But it's also important that we stop this very brand new day one framing of racism every time it happens in this country, every time we want to talk about it, where we say, does it really happen here? Is there racism in Canada? I can't count the number of headlines that I have seen in the last 5 years that say racism happens here too. It's like, yeah, guys, we know. But that kind of very intentionally naive framing holds us back from talking about how racism manifests. Where does it manifest? Let's talk about anti-Indigenous racism. Let's talk about anti-Black racism, right? We need to get past the idea that it may or may not be happening here because we're different from that other country to the south, and really be critical, be self-exploratory, be willing to look at what's happening here, no matter what we're going to find, and stop pretending that it's too dangerous to just state what we know, which is that this is a country built on a white supremacist ideology, and that actually has not changed in 150 plus years.
Angeline, Desmond, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil.